Barnett. I have for the past more than 12 years been doing a podcast with a partner of mine about the films of Paul Naschy. This podcast exists because of grief. In 2009, Paul Naschy passed away, and my friend Troy Gwynn and I were the only two people that we knew who were fanatics about Paul Naschy's movies. We have a large contingent of friends who share our bizarre interests in monster movies and horror movies and all kinds of things like that. But he and I were the only two who really enjoyed Paul Naschy to the extent that a couple times a year we'd get together and watch a couple of his movies on videotape, and we would try to, as time went by, find more obscure ones and things like that. And so we had, a few years before Mr. Naschy passed away, we had started to get the inkling that we might actually get to meet him and shake his hands and talk to him and tell him what we think. Because he'd started making, in the late 90s and early 2000s, several appearances in the States. And so we were fingers crossed that we would get a chance to do that, and then he passed away from pancreatic cancer in 2009. Out of the grief, I came up with the idea of, well, first, looking for a podcast where surely there's a podcast out there where someone is covering Paul Naschy's movies and talking about them in depth and going through them and scene by scene. And strangely enough, there was not such a thing, so we decided to create it. This has meant going through 50, or almost at this point, 60 of his movies, one at a time, scene by scene, laboriously. Some would say at far too great a length. Digging into every piece of ephemera that we can find about these movies, starting with his autobiography that he published in the late 90s, and every other thing that we can find, including contacting his sons and speaking with them and getting every bit of information that we can. Luckily, in the meantime, a few more books about his movies have been published, and the question does become, how many of you even know or have seen a Paul Naschy film? Did it involve a werewolf?
Yeah. I haven't seen the film, but I've read about him in Video Watchdog.
Yeah.
Which is the late great Video Watchdog.
Never to be forgotten, never to be surpassed.
They did like some really big stuff on him.
Yes, indeed they did. Some of it because I was pushing Tim to do it. The joys of Paul Naschy films is, like I say, in general, if you've seen one of his, especially if it's one that's more easily findable, it did involve a lycanthrope. It did involve a werewolf. He made, well, we should back up. The reason he was a monster-obsessed guy, which made him stand out from the pack to a large degree, is because of an influence on him when he was a kid. When he was a child, he became obsessed with monster movies and monsters in general, especially the Wolfman, because he got taken to a screening of Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. He was born in the 30s in Spain, and on a re-release a few years after that, when he was old enough to know what he was looking at, an uncle snuck him into a theater he wasn't supposed to be able to go. And he saw Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. And that is the template for what he pictured as these kinds of stories for the rest of his career. Now, in 2009, when Paul Naschy passed away, his real name, by the way, is Jacinto Molina, or Jacinto Molina Alvarez, but if you know Spanish culture, the last name is the last name of the mother, and so it's Jacinto Molina generally. Paul Naschy passing away in 2009.
I got lost, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I went into a phone thing and I didn't know.
You're here just after I've gotten over my fear of the microphone, so things are good. Do you fear the microphone?
I do stand-up comedy, so I'm not afraid.
Okay, so
of the
you
microphone.
do fear the microphone. Okay.
Yes.
When he passed away in 2009, it would have been very difficult, even in a room at a convention like this, to get people to understand that that man was an icon and was on par with, and in some ways more important to the genre, as Boris Karloff and Vincent Price. And the reason you can say this is because Boris Karloff, Vincent Price, Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, none of them ever wrote the vast majority of the horror movies they starred in. And he did. He was not only an actor, he was not only the person who was fronting the camera, he was also the man who was writing the scripts almost all of the time. This makes him incredibly important in what he was doing, because he was not only a fan of this stuff, he got to become a professional. He got to make these things. He got to, bankrupt himself eventually because of it, but that's a story down the road. He loved monster movies. And his first screenplay, the one that got produced first in 1968, is one that he didn't originally intend to star in, but I can't say that he probably strayed too far away from the idea once it was presented to him by the money man. He had written a screenplay called Mark of the Wolfman. Now, if you go looking for that film, you're going to look under a different title, because when it got brought over here by Sam Sherman, it got turned into a film called Frankenstein's Bloody Terror. He didn't change anything about the movie. There's no Frankenstein in the movie. There's a werewolf. There's a couple of vampires. There's
Bloody Terror.
There's Bloody Terror, this is for sure. But there is no Frankenstein. It's just that Sam Sherman needed a Frankenstein movie. He promised distributors that he would present them with a Frankenstein movie, so he bought American rights to Mark of the Werewolf and presented it as, under that title. This was a big budget thing. He got a lot of the money. A lot of the money came from Germany. They produced it in 70 millimeter and in 3D. Although I've yet to be able to see the damn thing in 3D, I'd love to. There were noises a few years ago that there was a print of it in 3D that was actually circulating around, being shown in art house cinemas, but it never came anywhere near me. And I'm not over that yet, in case you haven't been able to tell. So,
Poor guy.
we all live with, there are divorces and then there are things like that. It's terrible. So we get through. That's a big enough hit that he's able to continue writing these movies and getting them produced. There's a failed attempt, a legendary lost film that may or may not have gotten finished right after that. And then there's Assignment Terror, not the original title that it came out under, but it was another monster mash. In his first movie, he had a couple of vampires and a werewolf. In the next film he got produced, it's almost like somebody went, what if the day the earth stood still, the aliens were evil, and they wanted to resurrect the classic monsters to terrorize humanity? Which sounds like a great idea someone who was 12 came up with, and then they turned the damn thing into a movie. And we'll hire Michael Rennie, who was in Day the Earth Stood Still, and he'll be the evil alien leading this entire thing. So that got made, and it's a bit of a mess. It had two directors. At least both of them were sober, but one of them quit. Things like this. So it's an interesting film and has an excellent mummy in it, I'll grant you that. And once again, he played his werewolf character. Valdemar Daninsky. You'd have been hard-pressed to draw a straight line between the two werewolf characters in these two separate films, which, by the way, hang on to your pants because it's going to be that way for the rest of his career. The Universal films may have had a constant continuity, something you could follow. End of this one, creature is trapped in ice. Beginning of the next one, creature is trapped in ice. You're not going to get that with the Valdemar Daninsky films because the next film may actually start out in 15th century AD. You have no idea. No way to tell. Well, in 1970, on his third or fourth attempt, depending on how you want to count it, he struck gold. Because he finally found a director who really synced up with him beautifully, a man named Leon Klimovsky. And they produced a movie that is known under a lot of different titles, but the one that made him famous is called The Werewolf and the Vampire, or Versus the Vampire Women. It's known under other titles as well. If you look for it nowadays on Blu-ray, you're going to find it under the title Werewolf Shadow, or DVD, it's under Werewolf Shadow as well. Same movie, no big deal. But it, once again, is a monster mash. He's not going to just have a movie where you're just having one monster. It's got to be at least two or three. And in this, we have Elizabeth Bathory as a vampire, fighting the reluctant werewolf character. And it was a blast. It was a humongous success all over the world and made sure that for the next 5 to 6 years, he was going to be able to get money to make whatever horror movie he wanted to make. Sprinkled in amongst there, he made other kinds of movies as well, but of course what we're really interested in are those werewolf movies, those monster movies. Anything that he can do like that. And the joys of those is that, being a big monster fan, he didn't just stick with the werewolf thing. He played a mummy, he played another werewolf, he did other things too. But he was, my favorite of his films from this period always tend to be movies that even modern audiences, when they see them finally, kind of can't understand how in the world all of these things work together in a single film. And a good example of that is one of his best It's a movie called Horror Rises from the Tomb, came out in 1972. To say that movie has a little bit of everything is to shortchange the concept of everything. You've heard everything in the kitchen sink. This has the kitchen, the sink, the refrigerator. You got your zombies, you got your possession, you got, instead of a cross being the symbol that can keep away the evil possessed creatures, it is this bizarre silver crossed hammers of Thor. You want strange mythology? This movie can throw it at you. And this is the kind of creativity that just always pops up in these movies. They may be threadbare, they may be lower budget than they really needed. They may have the occasional actor that is pretty clearly trying to figure out what the next line's supposed to be and hoping that someone will whisper it to him. But you will have your monsters, you will have a certain amount of bizarre fun, and of course, eventually a werewolf's going to pop up and rip somebody's throat out. Now, as the 70s progressed, he made a lot of these kind of movies, and believe it or not, within just the restrictions of what he had in front of him, there's a lot of stuff. He made a Haitian zombie movie, which has some questionable ethnic stereotypes. Let's just leave it at that. The stranger things that came about were when he would add strange combinations together, and then once you see them, you may think from the title, how in the world are we combining a werewolf and Dr. Jekyll? And then you see the movie and you go, oh, we're really doing it. We're going to take a werewolf and try to cure him by injecting him with the Hyde formula. Yeah, that's going to work out well. And how we didn't get a 40-foot tall werewolf, no one knows.
Yeah.
But it
Really.
should have been, yeah, really.
Or, a Hulk werewolf.
Which honestly is pretty close to what happened anyway. So the creativity that was bubbling off of him during this period, what was kind of known at the time as the golden age of Spanish horror, lasted from roughly the late 60s to, depending on who you talk to, the late 70s. Some people want to push it on into the 80s, but honestly, by the time you get to the late 70s and the early 80s, it's over because horror movies aren't getting the money anymore, because by then the dictator of Spain has passed away, censorship has been lifted, and you don't have to hide quite so many things on the big screen. You don't have to hide behind, let's just call it the crass symbolism of monsters. You can just sling it all out there because nobody's minding the story anymore. This meant that he was able to be a bit more creative himself, and he made some really interesting films. He did a film called Inquisition that is an exceptional movie, historical horror based much more in reality, no monsters there, unless you count hideous people clawing at each other trying to make their way through life in the sloppiest way possible. And then he made even a few movies that I would say are worth seriously considering for the Criterion Collection. Movies based on real-life horrors that took place in Spain in the early 1900s, a movie called The Frenchman's Garden, which is an exceptional movie that showed how talented he had become, because by that time he had become a triple threat. He was also moving behind the camera and directing some of these movies as well. So he continued to make monster movies right until he couldn't make monster movies anymore and had to take a lengthy break because, he bankrupted his own company by trying to make a comedy. Anybody want to figure out why making a comedy, if you primarily are known for making monster films, might be a bad idea? That's your perfect example. That's a good idea to look at. The fact that he really, out of all the stuff that's coming out in Europe in this vein, horror movies per se, in the 1970s, the reason he stood out is not just because he was Spanish, but because he was Spanish, it was different. These were made in Spain. They always had a different flavor, and not just because they were primarily monster movies. You didn't necessarily, he would make a police thriller here and there. He made a movie about a modern day Jack the Ripper at one point, and those are technically more mainstream films, but at the same time, he always gravitates toward monster movies. That's what he loved. That's what he wanted to make. To the point where, even as his career ebbed and flowed, and past the 1980s, mostly ebbed, even when he got the chance to come to the United States to make a couple of movies, one of them turned out to be another werewolf movie. And it's my understanding that Mr. Naschy even insisted that we we have to have Valdemar Daninsky in that particular film that you made with him.
That's correct.
Now, what year was it that you guys made? Well, I first knew it under the title Tomb of the Werewolf, but its real title is The Unliving.
It's the other thing, yeah.
It was early 2000s. He had come over to, I know, to make another, a low-budget film with Don Bluth.
He was here to make, he wanted to come here to do Countess Dracula's Orgy of Blood. And it was just the role of a padre. And it was only a one-day part. And he didn't want to come here for one day. And my wife at the time was the line producer of the other film. And she came home and said, they've got this horror star they want to bring over, but he doesn't want to come over for one day. She goes, is there anything you can do with this guy so that he would come over and do this film? And I didn't have, and nobody has like a movie laying around waiting to go. But I said, well, let's make a monster movie, cheap, on the cheap. And I looked at some of the movies. I went out and got some of them, and I watched them because I wasn't that familiar. And I said, let's take a bunch of them. We did. If you see the movie, lots of elements of the old Spanish films are in there.
Yep.
And Elizabeth Bathory is in there, and she's, the stake was a big cross of a metal ornate thing that they pulled out of him. And we said, hey, why don't we make a werewolf movie? And I thought he would balk at that. But he said, yeah. And he said, how about we, and it was his idea to call the character this name. So we did. But, I was going back to what you were saying. A lot of people don't realize, because you pegged it, the Spanish, problem with foreign films, all foreign films died at a certain period of time. When I came up in the business, I'm sure a lot of you don't know who Eduardo Sarlui was, but Eduardo Sarlui and his daughter Helen, they call Continental Film Organization. And they brought in Italian and Spanish films, and they were always a Road Warrior ripoff or Conan the Barbarian ripoff, and they were famous for doing this. And these films, eventually, the American public got tired of watching dubbed movies. They didn't like it. And that started to kill these films. And you got to a point now, there were no more exploitation films coming out of Italy or Spain or Thailand. Thai had a thing, and the Philippines had their own thing, because people didn't want to see dubbed movies anymore. And Franco, while it literally was almost like a communist country, they subsidized those films. The government put the money into those Paul Naschy movies. And that's how those films were being made, is they were getting government money to make these films. And then when that all collapsed, you can literally almost mark your calendar from the time that Franco died till the time the Spanish film industry died, as a general rule. As far as foreign exports go, the Cannes Film Festival or MIFED Variety used to be the size of a telephone book. Now it's the size of like a National Enquirer. And it would be just page upon page of foreign people with westerns.
Yep.
And gladiator films and Hercules this and that. But you can, as far as the Spanish horror and stuff, you can literally mark the day when Franco died and the time the government said, we're not giving you guys money to lose, because the American market was your big market. And who would take the Paul Naschy films here? That's why so many of them were public domain. The companies that took them were Sam Sherman's. Yep. And even smaller companies, even more threadbare companies. And if you don't have an American sale, you don't have anything.
Well, another thing that stomped on a lot of the films that we love that were coming out of Europe at the time, especially out of Spain, is that once Franco, the dictator of Spain, once he passed away and the censorship went away, we have to understand that you could watch movies in Spain, they just could not have certain things in them. So even when they were making exploitation films that they knew they were going to export all the way around the world, they would shoot the scenes that involved nudity two ways, with the nudity and then the covered version, where the characters wouldn't be nude. And so the version that got showed in Spain didn't have any nudity. Everywhere else in the world, there was nudity. So once that died and censorship went away, anybody who's actually willing to put money into the production of a film in Spain just wants a sex movie, because that is what the main populace of Spain, we're talking just for domestic consumption, all they wanted now were sex comedies and movies that involved tons of nudity. The more nudity, the better. And that is all that was the concern for what was being shown for like the next 5-6 years in Spain. It was crazy.
What actual time period was this?
Spain?
No, I mean, what time period?
Late-
Oh, we're
late
talking like
70s.
1978, 77, 78 to about 81, 82.
Right.
If a movie was being made for general domestic consumption in Spain,
Yeah.
you could, I mean, if you said, yeah, it's like 4 naked women and they kind of sit around and complain and eat a pizza, they're gonna pay you money.
You
Throw money
can
on the
mark it
table.
by Saturday Night Live when they were making fun of Franco being dead.
Yeah.
During that period of time. And these films weren't, even if they had English actors, these films weren't being shot with sound.
No.
Because they would have a German actor, you'd have a Spanish actor, you'd have Peter Cushing, you'd have any number of people. So the movies weren't shot with sound. So even if they had a lot of English actors, you'd still going to get a dubbed film at the end of the day because they don't know how to shut up. Because they don't know, most of these films were shot silent because Italy was not a big market. The Italians relied on foreign markets for their exports, so they didn't bother to shoot sound because the Italian language was such a small thing, and the Mandarin, the Chinese, they wouldn't shoot with sound either, and they would have Klaus Kinski, and he'd be talking German, this guy's talking French, and they'd all just watch each other. When the guy shut up, they knew it was their turn to speak. And Gordon Mitchell gave me a great example of one of the films where they told him to say anything he wanted. And whenever it was his turn, everybody would stop talking and Gordon would speak. And he did a rendition of Mary Has a Little Lamb. And he said, Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. And then later it became, rise up against the emperors of Rome. You know, and he was doing Mary Had a Little Lamb. And when Gordon stopped talking, the next guy who was speaking, whoever, Argentinian or whatever, he knew now it's my turn to talk. And that's how they would do this. So all they had were dubbed films.
It was cheaper that way in a lot of different ways because, and this is something that drove a lot of actors insane, is shooting it without sound. They could be shooting one scene and literally just off camera, they could be building the sets for what they were going to film next, hammering away because it didn't matter. It was just another way for them to get away shooting cheaper and faster and knowing that all the sound effects, all the music, all the voices, everything was going to be put in later because that was just the cheaper way to get the most expensive portion of the production done fast, which is the time where you've got everybody on a set running film through a camera.
And, yeah, they'd have 5 languages.
Yeah.
You'd have a French version, Italian version, you'd have this version, this version. They would very quickly, they had a version for every territory because that's where their business was. I worked in India, and in India they didn't record sound. And they would literally be standing over here sawing a piece of wood while the actors were acting in front of the lens. There'd be a guy over here sawing. And of course we ran sound, and they would have crews of 100 people. And they were all, like you said, building the sets and running drills, while the actors are trying to actually, they're trying to do, not just, forget they weren't being recorded, they're still trying to perform. They're still trying to do their lines. And they'd be drilling and hanging stuff, and they had crows that flew through the studio making noises and stuff and living in the rafters, and it's very primitive. Some of these filmmaking techniques are very primitive.
Go ahead. I mean, if you've got questions, go ahead. I guess we can kick it open for questions. Not from you. Never.
No, I was gonna say, is that why Sergio Leone, did he just take was he just much more paid attention to that he knew the dubbing was doing this to the movies? Because they don't seem to be as bad.
Oh, well, it all depends on how much time you've got. It all depends on your budget.
Yeah.
Now, if you're talking about the Dollars trilogy that Leone made in the 60s, the things that kind of catapulted
Which were
him.
dubbed afterwards,
Yeah, all of that is dubbed afterwards, and of course, if you're smart, you contract your big star with a recognizable voice, so that he has to come in and do his own dubbing.
Didn't Clint Eastwood do
Yes.
his own dubbing?
They would insist on it. Christopher Lee was dubbed in all those early Italian and Spanish films in the early 60s. I think he saw himself as Sherlock Holmes in some movie, and it wasn't his own voice. So from that point on, his contract insisted, because they do looping anyway. I mean, these actors are dynamite. I mean, any TV show that's shot at Warner Brothers Studio, they don't stop for an airplane going overhead. Dukes of Hazzard.
They don't have time. They don't have time.
And then you would shoot for 8 days, for an episode, 1 hour episode, and then 2 days of your week would be to go in and dub the previous week's episode and do the looping.
And some of it would be clean and you wouldn't have to redo it, but some of it you would.
Yeah, if you were inside, that would be clean, but outside, they wouldn't
Yeah.
stop for sounds of traffic or a semi-truck going by, the Warner Brother or Olive, they own the Olive Street Studios. But yeah, most of those actors insist on it being their voices, you know?
I don't know, I was just thinking, that when you watch the trilogy, that it doesn't seem to be as bad. I mean, you can spot it.
It all depends on whether or not the actors were instructed to speak in English, because that's how we're absorbing it, and that is essentially the way Italians, Spaniards, all of the people making those films at that point in time, they knew that the biggest market for most of these kinds of films, especially westerns, were going to be an American or a British audience, and so trying to get your actors to speak, even if it's only phonetically or only if it's pretty close, try to speak something that approximates what's being, what's on the script page in English, is going to help, because remember all the way through the 70s and the 80s, they're throwing fake American names on these actors and directors, trying to convince you this sucker was made somewhere in Arizona instead of in the desert of Spain, which is where most of them are produced. So yeah. I mean, if you could get the actors to speak or move their mouths in a way that approximated something like English, that's what you were going to do, and that's when you can get fooled sometimes. That's when you can think. You can kind of lose yourself. But as he said, as time went on, it's not that things got necessarily sloppier. It's that over time, any movie fan is going to eventually figure it out, and it's going to be one of those odd little things that you either enjoy the oddity of it, how it kind of has this weird distancing effect when you're watching an obviously dubbed voice, or it's going to push you away. It either attracts or repels depending on your predilection for this kind of weirdness. And the joys of, there are all these stories throughout, just in Naschy's career, there are all these stories of productions where things go wrong. My favorite is they were making, later on the night they'll be showing you, they'll be screening Count Dracula's Great Love. So he played Count Dracula, okay? He's not built to play Count Dracula. Understand, Paul Naschy was a weightlifter. Real, like championship weightlifter. He has that body, that build. That's not Christopher Lee's body. That's not what that looks like. That's not Bela Lugosi. But, he wrote the movie, so let him do it, right? Well, while they were making that movie, there were four female actors in it, and 2 of them were in a car accident in the middle of production, to the point where they were in the hospital for a while. And so, keeping the money rolling and keeping things in check, the director and Naschy and some other members of the cast put their heads together. Naschy pulled out, Naschy had always like a stack of scripts that he was hoping to get produced. He pulled another one off the stack, and the director, the star, and some of the other actors took that script and ran and made that movie, which is called Hunchback of the Morgue. And then, when those actresses were able to get out of the hospital, they came back. They completed Hunchback of the Morgue, came back and finished Count Dracula's Great Love, and then moved on to the next production. And all of this is being done at breakneck pace. When you see these movies, you can kind of understand it, because Count Dracula's Great Love, there comes a point in the movie where you realize we're missing something here. Something has gone off track. I mean, it's gorgeous and it's creepy, but that first half of the movie is linear, and the second part gets much stranger. And it's because they literally had to stop it and restart 2 months later. And then if you look at Hunchback of the Morgue, its story makes sense from beginning to end. It's just insane. There are touches of H.P. Lovecraft that pop up in Hunchback of the Morgue at a certain point, and you realize once that happens, once this lurching, let's call it an early version of the tar monster from Return of the Living Dead, stumbles out of this cage that it's been kept in, and it advances toward its somewhat unwilling victims, you can cast your mind back in that movie and go, how did we get here again? But as you're watching the movie, it all seems to make sense. It all works just fine. But it's pure madness. And the ones that really fire on all cylinders make you forget at a certain point that there's some element that you're overlooking, that there's some little piece or strange oddity that you don't really care about because you're just being carried along. And that's the joy of these things. And like I say, Naschy kind of stands out for a lot of different reasons because, like I say, he wrote these things, he directed a lot of them, not just as an actor, so he is unique in a lot of ways for that, but he's also unique in that he loved this until the day he died. He died in production on another horror movie, trying to get it finished. And by the time you worked with him, I mean, he was just, I mean, granted, I mean, he'd gotten past his most bitter period of time. I mean, he had ebbs and flows past the 80s. I mean, he had a truly horrendous year in 1984 where his company goes bankrupt because they made a comedy, and then his father passes away. And he goes into about a 3-year depression. He goes back into weightlifting, becomes a middle-aged champion weightlifter, produces a film that they get completely finished and then never gets released except for one screening on Spanish television until recently. That movie is called Howl the Devil and is now on Blu-ray. And by the way, there's a commentary track on it.
How is it working with him, Frank?
How's it work? I'm sorry. Oh, well, that's just it. By the time he gets to work with him, it's even later in his career. But he's finally at that point been able to attend some conventions and meet a lot of American fans and British fans and realize that he's not the forgotten person that he thought he was at that point. And so it's like some of the bitterness had started to seep away. And I think that, I mean, you got to drive around LA with him. So
What's the
What
question?
was it like with working with him? You know,
Senor Molina spoke no English, none at all. Good morning was the most English he could speak. So I took a book called Just Enough Spanish, and I tried to communicate. You know, his son Sergio could speak not great English, but enough, and his wife, I believe her name was Elvira.
yep.
She could speak English as well. And they loved me. They came in, Don Bluth was incredibly cheap, and he placed him in a Holiday Inn Express on La Brea near Sunset. And I know Sergio called me and said, we're in this terrible hotel, it's pouring rain, my father's miserable, can you help? I said, let me see what I can do, and I'll come down there. So we came down there, it was it was like a Motel 6. And I said, I don't know where to take you. I said, but let's check out of here. Let's get out of here. So his son was with him, his wife was with him, so we took him out. I had my little kids with me. It's pouring rain. I took him up to the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel, where they used to have the Oscars. And it's one of the grand dames of Hollywood, across from the Man's Chinese. And I went in and I said, can you get these people a room? We'll take care of it. And they did, and they were forever grateful. And he was in love with the Universal Monsters. He didn't really want to do the Universal tour. He wanted the hat. He wanted the baseball cap that said Universal Pictures. So we drove him over there, and he wanted to see the Magic Castle where I was a member. So we took him to the Magic Castle one evening.
was this his first trip to Hollywood?
I believe it may have been.
Wow.
And he learned his line phonetically in English. I've seen things where people write things about me, and if they write them about me, they probably write them about everybody that aren't true at all. And I don't know where they come from, but I read somewhere not long ago that his role was dubbed, and it's not true. It's exactly the way it was recorded the day that he shot it. We don't dub a lot of films into English right at my level. He learned it in English. I mean, it's rough. You can tell if I dubbed it into English, it'd be clearer to understand. But he was, and we did it so that he wouldn't have to. We wrote it so that he wouldn't have to carry the film in dialogue. You know, he's seen in a flashback, he became this creature. But then once he's revived, he's like a werewolf, you know, for the rest of the movie. And he had a limp because he had a bad knee. And we had a stuntman who doubled for him in the real big action scenes, like chasing someone down, and then when they hit the ground, then Senor Molina would come in and jump on them, you know, and he'd rip their neck out and turn, and you know, he loved it. And he was the old-fashioned werewolf. I told the makeup people, I said, I want it to look just like, and it's actually better. The actual, I don't care. You watch those movies tonight, the werewolf makeup that we did on him was better than ones in the Spanish films for the most part. It was really nice. And it was the old Lon Chaney Jr., you know, type with the teeth and the appliances you could pull the skin away from the neck. And he looked great. I mean, he looked fantastic. And, you know, he wasn't a young man, but we made him look as young as we could. He had darker hair and long hair. He had the Victorian clothes or whatever the Renaissance storyline was for the flashbacks. So he had beautiful costuming. And he really, really, really got into it. But he did have to sit there and have that Wolfman makeup put on him. I remember he kept telling them how itchy it was. I thought, well, you're the guy who stars as a werewolf. I mean, you might expect it to be itchy, you know. It was hard to feel sympathetic for it because he asked for it, I mean, technically. But he was very kind to us, and it continued for years to come. We have always got a Christmas card from them. And at one point they invited us to Spain, and we flew to the Estepona International Film Festival in Marbella on Costa Soleil. And I showed my space shuttle disaster film, Black Horizon, there, and we won a few awards. And we saw some Paul Naschy films that are still not been distributed in the United States, which we're thinking about trying to get for Blu-ray. We're just not sure, because most people who have put out Mr. Molina's films have not had great success with them, for the same probably reasons why they were all distributed by bottom of the barrel drive-in distributors when they were new. And that's been the biggest problem that they had, is they needed that United States market, and then they would bring those films here and they'd end up getting an offer from the lowest of the lows in the theatrical distribution. They couldn't get their money back.
Yeah, most of his movies were primarily seen not even in grindhouses, but in drive-ins. During the 70s, that's where most of his films, and they would get recycled year after year after year.
Well, and then they would register for a copyright, so then Vampire Werewolf versus Vampire Woman or whatever would appear on like Poverty Row, you know, DVD labels from beat up 16 TV prints.
Yep.
I saw Frankenstein's Bloody Terror in a theater when it was new. I couldn't believe my eyes. I mean, from the cartoon at the beginning that tried to explain why it was called Wolfstein or something.
Yes.
The Frankenstein monster transformed into a werewolf in the cartoon, and then away it went.
Yeah, yeah.
No.
Like, this is all the explanation you're gonna get.
The
Why there's no werewolf.
vampires
Yeah.
had a stick in their cape, and they walked around with their capes like this, and I'm like, what the hell is this?
Oh, I love that. The first time I showed my poor long-suffering girlfriend, when I first showed her that movie, it's hilarious. But the moment the two characters show up who are obviously who are there as doctors, and they step off the train at night and there's fog around them, Beth just turns to me and goes, "Well, they're vampires." Yeah.
And it's always the colored gels. That's the sort of,
It's like,
the
oh,
colored
this
gels out in the
blue-colored
middle
gel
of the
across
night.
the image.
But you know, there was something, like you said, there was something interesting. But the drive-ins were a Wild West show. You'd go there for 5 movies in a night, and the third one happened to be one of these films, or Demon Witch Child, or those Blind Dead movies where they're on a boat or something. And they'd be, you know, you'd go and you'd see Planet of the Apes or whatever the new Apes movie was, and there'd be 3 like this.
Yeah,
You know, if you could stay awake,
I loved it.
you could see all kinds of shit, you know?
Yeah.
I saw She Was a Hippie Vampire, which was a black and white movie by Jerry Warren that I guess was also called Batwoman. But it was called She Was a Hippie Vampire. I saw Blood of the Man Devil with Lon Chaney Jr. in a theater. They say it was never released theatrically, but I saw it. And I got the ad map cut out of the paper to prove it.
So did any major studio, did any Naschy film ever get picked up by any major studio?
No, the distributors, the companies that distribute them over here, I mean, there were no majors that released them. It was always an independent production or distribution company that would get their hands on them and bring them over here. And
Sam was the biggest
yeah,
one.
he was the biggest. He did
House of Psychotic Women, was that an Naschy film? And
yeah, it was also known
The
as Blue
Howling
Eyes, the
Beast
Broken
or
Doll.
something.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Independent International, I mean, they were at the bottom rung of the ladder, but they were the biggest, probably most mainstream distributor that ever.
But they made bank off of those movies because they would buy the rights to them for a number of years, and like I say, they would recycle them every 18 months through the theaters that they had deals with, And if they needed to slap a new title on it, they'd come up with some slight variation on the original title that they'd send it out under and send it out again and make more money off of it.
Well, the prints would also become abandoned at times at film exchanges because a little guy couldn't distribute himself. Sam from New York had no way to get his stuff into a theater in Miami or Florida. So there was a company in Jacksonville called Clark Brothers. Clark Brothers are what they call the sub-distributor. And they would handle your distribution in their territory for all the little independents guys who weren't big enough for their own exchanges. But sometimes the drive-ins would send the prints back and the Clark Brothers would not return them. So the prints would sit at Clark Brothers, and whenever they needed a fifth movie, they'd go, well, we got a print of this. They'd send it back out. These things would play until the print fell apart. I think the most popular one was Horror of the Blood Monsters, one of Sam's films, because it didn't need any artwork. All you had to do was put the title as the third feature, and it was okay, because the title was so exploitive. But these prints would get abandoned. You'd see them, they'd be turning pink from age, and they'd be scratched up, or they'd take reel 1 of this one and a reel 2 of that same print, and combine them so they could keep getting a print that was playable. They'd throw away the old ones that were getting really shitty, and they would like build new prints out of reel 1 of this one. If this can had reel 2, it looked okay. They'd put reel 2 over, and these films would get abandoned, and then the Naschy films wouldn't get paid.
No.
Sam wouldn't get paid because Sam didn't know it was playing at the fourth feature.
Right.
You know, the print got left in Jacksonville and kept going out.
Yeah, even the distributor, the official distributor, would know that the film made like another $5,000 over the course of the next 6 months because it just wasn't getting reported.
Yeah, and the prints wouldn't come back. And the prints, that's why they turned pink. They were using a color process. They weren't supposed to last. These prints were supposed to be good for a year, 2 years. That's what they thought the drive-in market was worth, which is why so many people didn't bother to copyright their movies. They never occurred to anyone that someone might come along and steal that film. Who in their right mind would do that?
Well, in the early days of VHS, a lot of fly-by-night VHS companies in the 80s, they would be grabbing these 16mm prints, these rough road prints, and putting them out on videotape. And so you would see, oh wow, this thing's turned pink. This is a miserable looking version of this film, and yet, you know, how else were you going to see it at that point? It's not like the drive-ins around any longer.
Yeah, the film stock wasn't meant to last. So
Yeah, it's not supposed to be.
It doesn't hold the color.
Yeah.
It doesn't hold the color.
Did he keep control of his negatives, or what happened to them?
Well, that depends on, if you're talking about Naschy, it kind of depends on which film you're talking about, because it always depended on what conglomeration of people backed the movie. In other words, put money in to produce the film. And he had a lot of luck with German producers because they always had enough success. His movies always played very well in Germany. I mean, like always. His movies always did really well in Japan, which is how he ended up in the early 80s when his career kind of went sideways. Paul Naschy ended up making documentaries for Japanese television for like 3 years. And it's how he ended up financing one of his biggest budget werewolf movies, partially filmed in Japan, called The Beast and the Magic Sword. Also now available for the first time in English on Blu-ray.
With a commentary track by
me and
how did I know?
We did.
And this is all a guy who can't speak a lick of Japanese, English, or any other language. He only spoke Spanish.
Yeah, and they would just have translators around.
Yeah.
His best friend in the world, one of his best friends in the world was a Japanese. He wasn't even a film producer. He became a film producer. But a friend of his who lived in Madrid, who was a Japanese national, who realized that he could start cutting these deals, and so he, as a business partner, he was his friend and his business partner, and they got this thing going in Japan, where he shot Beast and the Magic Sword and two other, a crime film and another film in Japan, working in the studios owned and run by Toshiro Mifune. I mean, we're talking real money behind these movies, and you can see those movies now on Blu-ray, and they're obviously a cut above. There was real money behind these films, and to the point where there's a funny story about Beast and the Magic Sword. In its script for that film, there's a samurai. One of the things, the magic sword in it is described in the script as a silver sword, a sword made of silver. Of course, you figure how that's going to play into dealing with a werewolf later in the story, obviously. And so production had started on it, and the people were building different sets, and they were going through costuming and all this, that, and the other, and they bring him the sword. They said, we've crafted the sword, and they bring it to him, and he realizes they actually made the damn sword out of silver. Real, no joke, silver, a katana. made of silver. And he goes, oh my God, you didn't, he's like quickly getting the translator, you didn't have to do this. This isn't, it's just going to be on screen. It doesn't have to be, it can be stainless steel. It doesn't matter. And they're like, no, you said a silver sword, so here's the silver sword. It's made, it's done. And he was able, they gave that to him as a gift at the end of production. And
Did it kill him?
in the film, killed a lot of things in that film. It slaughtered a bunch of stuff.
You know, years ago, they did a reproduction of Lugosi's Ring from Dracula. And it was not the cheap ones, but, you know, if you remember, it was like a $600 version, came in its own wooden coffin and the whole bit. We had him wear it in the movie, and he was so enamored with it, we couldn't take it back from him. We let him have it, and he loved it. And then he said someone stole his Universal ball cap, so we had to go get him another one. If you see the Unliving DVD, which is a complete version, Tomb of the Werewolf is truncated. If you see it, there's a half hour. It was our intention at the time of making the film that we were going to do a reality show. Because we'd been asked a lot of times, and I wouldn't let people, a lot of TV people wanted to follow us around while we're making a film like this and see our lives and our little children and stuff. And I said, no thanks. I don't want my kids exposed to this. And so we said, let's do it ourselves. So we hired a photography crew who kind of lived with us while we were making Tomb of the Werewolf. And they followed us around. But we could never find anyone who could edit all of this footage together and make anything out of it that we were happy with. So we turned it into like a 30-minute documentary, and it's on the Unliving DVD, and you can see Signor Molina as he is, you know, getting his makeup on and coming to set in the morning, and everybody sort of struggling along to make this low-budget sort of horror film. And does anybody know who John Beekler is?
Yeah.
John Beekler came to help us out. We needed a scene where they were supposed to push open the coffin lid, and there would be Signor Molina's corpse. So John Beekler says to me, he goes, Freddie, he goes, I got a corpse of myself. He goes, and it's got my beard and all. I said, that's great, he has a beard. He goes, well, I'll make it look a little bit more like him, but it's really going to be me. I said, okay, fine. And they brought that corpse and put it in there, and that was Paul Naschy in the coffin when they first pulled the big silver thing out of him that caused him to revive. And that thing was custom made, but it was only one side. So we didn't have enough money to do it on both sides. So it's wood on one side, and on the other side it's this ornately hand-tooled silver giant cross sword type thing that they pulled out of his body. But it was certainly an interesting film. We tried to make a Gothic movie in 6 days in California for $60,000. And we literally almost lost our shirt on the film, even at that low budget, because we realized, we said, well, we'll put some erotic scenes in here because we were making bank on these Cinemax movies. And we thought, well, that's a safeguard. Let's put a safety valve in here in the event that this all goes south, we've got this. Well, we found out that nobody wants this with people having their throats ripped out. And nobody wanted an old-fashioned werewolf movie. They wanted werewolves that looked like The Howling or American Werewolf. They didn't want Lon Chaney. You know, there's a reason why nobody was making Lon Chaney Jr. type Wolfman movies, is that modern day buyers didn't want it. We finally lucked out and found a DVD distributor who would give us almost the budget of the movie for the US rights for 15 years. So we did come out of it okay. It was kind of one of those things that we did because we just wanted to do it. We didn't do it because we thought it was going to be a financial hit.
Well, I think to a degree you may have held out long enough that one of those cycles of what a certain public is looking back towards for nostalgia purposes, that the kind of thing they actually want to see again.
It might make a Blu-ray.
Yeah,
It might be worth doing.
Well, I mean, it's
Blu-ray.
been surprising. Like I say, the past 6 years, almost 20 of his horror movies have been put out on Blu-ray here in the States with all kinds of extras and commentary tracks and things like that. And it's been a bit of a shock to watch. You know, it's like you see people test the water and put like one of them out, and then you see another company announce like a 5-film set, and then you see another company putting out some more, and you're like, okay, well, somebody's buying these things besides me.
Well, I think they feel safer when you're doing, because like I bought a 5-film set,
Yeah.
just to see the Yeti and the werewolf, but I've never watched any of the others.
Oh, watch
But I
Hunchback
think-
in the Morgue on that set.
Oh,
Because
okay.
Yeah, first of all, commentary track.
But
But also,
if you
it's
make it a
completely
Valiant
insane.
pack- I did get Horror Rights from the Tomb and another thing, there was a double feature a few years ago.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I saw Count Dracula's Great Love at the theater, and not only was Senior Molina kind of stocky, he wasn't very tall.
No, he's not the tallest guy.
You know, we kind of looked at it, even as young people, we went, he's playing Dracula because he can.
Yeah.
I mean, what kid wouldn't want to be James Bond? I mean, when I started in the business, I thought, boy, would it be great to be the actor who plays James Bond or Dracula?
Well, I mean, I'll pull out the well-worn joke between my podcasting partner and myself, which is that, let's see, you're a virile man, happily married, don't get me wrong, but you're writing the movie, and there's going to be several very attractive women cast in the movie. Strange how that script has so many scenes where I end up in bed with every female member of the cast. It's very strange. But every single film is somehow or another. Even when he plays a hunchback, he ends up in bed with the most beautiful woman in the movie.
Because he can.
Because he can. You write the movie, you get the girl. That's the way it goes.
Well, you know, I think he probably looked and saw Lon Chaney Jr. playing Dracula. Exactly cadaverous.
That's true.
You know, and he wanted to be that guy. He wanted to be the guy who played the Mummy, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Dracula.
And he did it.
He wanted to be that guy.
Yeah.
He played all of those. I heard of that Howl of the Devil. They said Carol Monroe was in that.
Yeah,
And,
she and Howard Vernon. Caroline Monroe is amazing. One of the neat things about that is in Howl of the Devil, he almost plays a dual role. He plays two twin brothers, but when the movie starts, one of them is dead, and the one that's alive is the one you wish wasn't alive, because he's a scumbag. He's a true jerk. But the son of the passed away brother keeps having these visions of his dead father, who was a horror movie star. I wonder who he's playing there. And in each of those little fantasy segments where the son is kind of talking to either the ghost of his father or his imagined view of what his father was, once again, you get to see him in the werewolf makeup, you get to see him in Frankenstein monster makeup, you get to see him in playing the scumbag character, you get to see him dressed up like Fu Manchu and all these other characters, and it's just him, you know, raiding the costume closet to a large degree, and folding it all together in this, rather at times shocking bit of late 80s visceral horror that has a truly amazing kind of downbeat ending. It has slasher elements in it. It has all this kind of stuff, and it's just one of those movies that was completely impossible to see until just recently, unless you really wanted to see a completely washed out print that was taped off Spanish television in 1988. But we live in wonderful times now, people, because so many of his films, here's the weird part. This is where maybe if you can step in, so many of his films are available now, but some of the ones that made him the most famous, including the one that was his first gigantic worldwide hit, Werewolf versus the Vampire Woman, it's one of the ones that's not on Blu-ray for some reason. There's not even a decent DVD of it, and I don't know if that's a rights issue.
Well, I saw the DVD that Sam put out.
Not of that one.
Mark of the Werewolf.
Oh no, Mark of the Werewolf. Yes, I'm talking about.
I thought you meant Frankenstein's Bloody Terror.
No. There's gonna have to be a 3D release of Mark of the Werewolf.
I don't know that. I still contend that might not have been 3D, because you asked Sam about it, and he goes, "Well, the plastic lenses were inferior, blah blah blah." It sounds like somebody's lying to me.
Oh, really?
I don't know. The one thing we did do though is we had another project for Senor Molina that we had all talked about called Dr. Caligari's House of Nightmares. And he was going to play the museum curator of a wax museum, and he was going to play all the monsters again. They were going to do the Mummy and Frankenstein, and it was where they were trying to put the wax museum out of business, and the guy brings the characters to life to murder the people who are trying to close down his wax museum. It would have been great because he would have had to do almost no dialogue, which is what his issue was for us, was that he couldn't speak, and we didn't want to dub him. You know?
And he always retained that ability. He was very good with his face. It was all on the job training, but man, he could give you a truly wonderful menacing look.
Yeah, he was really, when he came out of the coffin and ripped Jay Richardson's neck out right away, he got a super round of applause. The whole crew just broke out because it was like we'd never seen anything like it before. But then you'd see that he had to wear a knee brace and his knee was very bad. And he had these sort of cavalier boots on or whatever they call those. But it was certainly interesting. His name was Jacinto Molina. And he, as I told you earlier, he gave us tons of stuff, books signed by him, but he spelled Naschy differently on several different occasions. He didn't spell Naschy the same way all the time. Sometimes he added an EY, or sometimes there would be no E before the Y. And I always kind of kidded him about the fact that the autograph would be different. If he wrote Paul Naschy, he would spell it differently from person to person that he was giving the autograph to. But he was very kind.
And when you told me about that earlier, I was remarking on how oftentimes that last name, which of course is just a stage name that he had to come up with kind of on the fly, because the producers of Mark of the Werewolf didn't want his name to be on. They didn't want the guy who wrote the film to be the same name as the guy who was starring in the movie. So that you got to come up with a fake name, and so they quickly came up with a kind of Germanic sounding, fake name for him.
Well, say his real name 5 times fast. It wasn't easy.
No.
Well, I mean, we had to sit there because it was spelled like Jacinto. And every time you went to speak to him, you'd have to think about how to pronounce his name, because it was Jacinto. But I mean, that's not how it came out. Like you get the makeup girl calling him one thing and the other. So we called him Senor Molina.
Yeah, that would be the safest. That would have been the safest way.
No one called him Paul Naschy, ever. Never. He never used that in like real life.
Just a stage name.
Well, here I couldn't sign into my room the other day. I couldn't check in because they didn't have my room. So they'd run my middle name and my last name together into one word. And then I couldn't get, I had trouble with the airplane because the airplane ticket had my middle name and last name running. I said, I never use my middle name.
How did they end up with it?
Because it's on your driver's license, and when you fill out a form, sometimes they'll ask you for your middle name, but then they'll run them together, and your last name becomes Olen. So you have to say, if they don't have your reservation, you have to say, look under O. Do you have it under O? And of course the woman goes. So now whenever I check into the internet here at the Marriott, I have to type in Olen as my last name.
Well, I could babble about Paul Naschy and his work for another 2 hours, bare minimum.
So that's your next commentary.
I got to tell you, we've done commentaries on about. I have to admit, I lost track at a certain point. But the beauty of researching all those films and all the actors and everyone in them, it's just there's so many interesting stories involved in those. But at the same time, I mean, if you've got any questions that maybe we can answer, go ahead and throw them out. Yeah.
Has anyone done a really good definitive biography of him that you would recommend as a starting point?
What about the book? He did his own autobiography.
He did an autobiography that he published in the late '90s, which
But
is quite
sometimes
good.
those are
Well,
embellished.
it's very
Well, you said good.
His autobiography is very good. Memoirs of a Wolfman is a great autobiography up to the point where he's written it. But also there's a lot of amazing stories in there. Man, there's some crazy stories in there. But the thing about that is the tone of it. When he wrote it, he was in a very bitter place, and some of that comes off in some of the comments and some of the things and how he phrases certain things and how he kind of places emphasis in certain areas. Not that makes it bad. It's just that in a way you're almost kind of getting a view of his life and his career filtered through one of the darker moments of his
It
life.
makes him human.
It does.
It's unvarnished.
Now there is a writer, Troy Howarth, has recently published, about 3 or 4 years ago, recently published a book that serves as a really great look at his career, but also because he went and talked to his widow and went and talked to his sons and interviewed multiple people who were involved in making movies with him. It's also a really good look at him as a person. And in our research for commentary, like I say, that's a good book. Those 2 books would be a great place.
I mean,
to
Troy
start.
did a great job with
Yeah.
his John Carpenter book. So if it's
Yeah.
anything close to that,
I just started his
really good.
Argento book, and it's well worth paying attention
Excellent.
to
Thank
as
you.
well. But as far as what I would consider just an autobiography instead of an autobiography and one that also looks in depth at each one of his films, honestly, you kind of would want both. I kind of think what Howarth did with his book is a really good idea of what to be done. To my mind, what we need is a series of books focused on each one of his on each one of his movies, one after the other, because I'm completely insane. And
I was going to say, it
wanna-
sounds a little obsessive.
Yeah,
That's a little OCD.
I would say it's a little
Yeah.
over.
And they need to have the same spines all lined up for it.
The really depressing thing is there is a really fantastic documentary about his life and career called "The Man Who Saw Frankenstein Cry." That still hasn't gotten any kind of real it came out in, I think, 2010 or 11. Still has not got a decent video release over here at all, or any video release over here whatsoever. If you can find it, you're going to find a bootleg of it, and it's fantastic. I mean, they interview all kinds of people who, I mean, you'll recognize immediately, talking about how Paul Naschy influenced them as filmmakers or creators or writers. And it explains the title of it, because one of the when he was trying to break into the industry in the '60s, they filmed an episode of I Spy in Spain, and he was an extra as a bit part in that I Spy episode. And if you watch the episode, you can spot him. He's got just this bit roll in the background, and you can see him. But Boris Karloff was in that episode of I Spy.
Oh, that's so.
He got to meet and speak with Boris Karloff. And it's that point, it's in 1966, where Karloff, his body he was in a lot of pain all the time. And one of the things, Senor Molina couldn't take his eyes off Boris Karloff, of course. And he saw him, he was in so much pain at certain points that he was just sitting and just weeping because of the pain. And then they'd call him to set, and he would be Boris Karloff, exactly how you would expect. And, we can't, I mean, like I say, there's got to be somebody out there that thinks they can make some money off a documentary about Paul Naschy, but it's not happened yet. I don't know if the people who made it are asking too much.
It's hard to find these people sometimes.
Yeah.
It's hard to find them. There's a one-way ticket to Hollywood, Peter Cushing documentary. I'm sure people probably love to see that. I've seen it. It's
I would
fantastic.
love to see it. I've only heard of it.
You can't get it because the guy won't let it out. Yes.
I was gonna say, especially Fred, since you grew up and saw all this stuff in the drawing and stuff, what is your take on seeing all these exploitation films being curated so lovingly by Severin and Media Blaster and, I mean, even there's something even sort of questionable ones even Criterion picked up, that you go, really? So are you?
I think you nailed it. I mean, because I have a Blu-ray company myself, and so I know what it is to market, sell, and try to get the money back.
Doing that?
And I look at some titles people bring out. I like some of the Euro crime drama from the 4K negative. I said I wouldn't put my money on that horse. And then you see the guy from Code Red going, "Oh, nothing ever sells 1,000 units." I said, "You're picking the wrong titles, brother. I don't have that problem." So I'm very cautious, and and it's like, the word classic is thrown around way too loosely today.
Yeah.
Oh, this classic. I said, are you kidding? That's a piece of crap. We hated it when it came out, and it's bad now. And I mean, they're like, oh, I was just waiting for Trog to come, waiting for Trog. I said, you know what? I remember Trog. Your best bet on Trog is to walk in after the first 20 minutes. It's already gone by. And it's a movie that you look at and you say, I really want to like this, but it's Trog. Now what have you got? You got a Blu-ray of Trog. You know what I mean? Of the classic Trog, or the one that we all know.
Well, I think at a certain point, and I don't know when this was, and I would like to find out when this was so that we can travel back in time and stop it. The word classic suddenly started to stand in for old.
Well, yeah, and I would say to people, because, we get a lot of people who want to get new films they've just made. And I said, people today would rather get Invasion of the Blood Farmers from like 1974,
Yeah.
which is awful, than a better movie that somebody's made in, say, Georgia, with their own actors and stuff. A better film.
And it's at Walmart.
That's right. They would rather have that shot on film thing that they hated. For some reason it tastes better now than it did in 1974. In 1974 it was awful.
Don't discount nostalgia.
Now it's revered, yes.
Don't discount nostalgia.
Do you think it's going to bust at some point? Is it going to the bubbles going to
Well,
bust?
I mean, is there anything good left? I mean, it feels like sometimes that we're scraping the barrel of things to put out. Feels like almost like I paid a lot of money to restore Deathmaster, the Robert Quarry movie, because I found out that AIP didn't own it, which meant that MGM didn't own it. So I tracked that thing down until I found the owner, and I had to convince them they owned it. They didn't believe me. So once I finally convinced them that they owned Deathmaster, I made them a deal, and then I paid $8,000 above my licensing fee to restore Deathmaster. And then I had a contract for it, and I put it out a couple times, and then that person went out of business and their library went to Lionsgate. And I have been 2.5 years now at Lionsgate saying, come on, man, I restored this movie. I'm the right guy for the Blu-ray. I have Robert Quarry doing the commentary track, which belongs to me. I'm the right guy for this title. Let me have it. And it's just literally crickets. And then they'll say, oh, are you talking about you just want domestic rights? Yes, fine, just domestic rights. Crickets. And it's like a month goes by. Any movement on this? I mean, it's just, there's almost, that's something that's still out there. But very few things that are really worthwhile are still out there, unless someone stumbles upon.
Well, there are nooks and
Something.
crannies. There are
Yeah.
little films here and there. There's like Lemuria, which Synapse put out on DVD and people wish would come out on Blu-ray. But then you run into, there can be a gap between what is possible for one format and possible for another, and whether the upgrade will make the film look any good at all, or if you're just releasing a glorified version of a DVD.
You ever look at the James Bond films? They redid them all on Blu-ray or
Yeah.
HD, then put them out on DVD. Play Dr. No on DVD next to a TV playing the Blu-ray of Dr. No. You realize it's the same exact transfer.
No.
And I mean, literally, if you turn them back on and off, it would be hard to tell the difference between them. And a lot of people have said that a lot of Blu-rays don't look any better than the DVD they have of the same item.
If the DVD
Because they're the
was-
same
if it was well
transfer.
mastered. If it was well mastered.
Yeah, they're the same transfer.
Right, you don't go to the source.
And then there's Trog.
Quality.
Which, by the way, Trog on Blu-ray was somebody's dream come true, and we need to find out who that person is.
You didn't do the audio commentary for that one.
No, here's what's funny. I would have, gladly, but no one asks me to do that.
He's going to do it on Trog versus Werewolf.
There you
Oh
go.
yeah, if they make that film, that would have been great. Imagine a combination of the Valdemar Daninsky werewolf films and Trog. I'd be there all day long.
No, they
I
can
call
keep,
that-
they can
that'd
keep
be
going.
expensive.
You ever see Beast in the Cellar? That's a terrible movie. Let's make a Blu-ray of that. Everybody can fall all over
I
themselves.
have that.
There you go. You have it on Blu-ray?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I bought it as part of a group of films all in one shot because it was cheaper than buying the others that I actually wanted more.
Yeah, there you have it.
That's how they get you.
But you know, are there 1,000 people? We get people coming to us saying, you have Blancheville Monster in HD. Please put it out on Blu-ray. And there's a whole campaign to write me and pressure me to put it out on Blu-ray. You have it on HD, put it on Blu-ray. And I actually I authored it with another movie called Strangler of the Tower. I authored it to Blu-ray. But you know, as they say, Beauty and the Beast, I stayed my hand. I did not send it off to be made into a Blu-ray because I started to believe that it was 10 people pretending to be 100. And I need 1,000. You know, because everybody said, oh, put Octoman out, put Octoman, could you please put Octoman out? I put Octoman out. I haven't cracked the first 1,000 yet, it's 5 years later. So it was 50 people acting like there were 500 people demanding Octoman.
But don't some DVD players
don't be
convert
fooled.
anyway?
Yeah, they do, yeah.
As long as what you have is a well-mastered disc in the first place, and that can be tricky. Sometimes it's not. Don't get me wrong.
We've got a lot of HD stuff that we're sitting on. I'm just scared to put it out. Phantom of Soho and Monster of London City, original double feature,
Oh,
HD.
You're not
Screenings?
Already ready to go.
Those are good movies. Those are good movies. Those are fun.
Vinegar
See?
Syndrome and Sever and all these people doing that stuff, you're not tempted to join the fray.
I'm not willing to lose money on the
You
deal.
guys are obviously having fun, and I hate to interrupt, but we've got to set up for the next
Oh.
panel. I'm really sorry.
I'm sorry. No problem.
And you guys should still applaud them.
What is-